relax. I try to be as entertaining as possible. And of course, there's no exam, as you know. Even in our 3C class, Center for Creativity, Innovation, Entrepreneurship, students only are required to write a report. The minimum score is 70, the maximum is 95. And it's an open topic, okay? Because I knew exam is the number one creativity killer. All right, that's for examination, but let's go on. Okay. This topic, Enigma of human creativity, is a very old topic. I suspect even during the Greek period, people are interested in that, okay? So there's, of course, good reason to be interested in that. And in the past century, then of course there's an intense effort of research for over a century. It's done mainly by psychologists and later by cognitive scientists. But they did not go very far. And in fact, in my opinion, they got a very misleading result. As you know, in the United States, cognitive scientists are the architect of educational policy. And the trouble today, they are responsible for the trouble today. All right. Now, why do I show you this? It was a very special occasion. Beg your pardon? Oh, yeah, I know. Okay, good. Thank you. No problem. All right. Okay, 2006 happened to be the 115th anniversary of the birth of Nikola Tesla. You may not know him well, but he was of equal caliber with Thomas Edison, and he was once hired by Thomas Edison as a very capable assistant. And one day, Edison told Tesla, if you solve this problem, I'm going to give you a $10,000 raise. So he went ahead and solved the problem, and he did it, and came back to cash in. And Edison told him, I think you Europeans don't quite understand our Americans' humor. We don't really mean it. However, you did such a good job. I'm going to give you a raise. And he did a quick calculation in his mind. And over his lifetime, he couldn't quite accumulate an additional $10,000. So he quit right on the spot. And he became the major competitor of, and rival, of course, Thomas Edison. He invented electric motor, and he's best known for Tesla coil in the Science Museum. Well, 2006 is also a very special occasion because it happened to be another genius. 250th anniversary, just 100 years apart. And these two geniuses represent talent in two sides. One is humanity, art, music, right? The other one is science and engineering. And the most popular theory in the United States, the theory of multiple intelligence, think these are two very different talents. I will try to convince you these are one and the same talent, okay? Well, now comes the question, can creativity be taught? If you go on the internet, there are many workshops, both here and in the United States, and even in school. There are programs offered for training. And last year, Tina said it, of Stanford published a very, one of the bestseller book about how to train for creativity. And I remember 4 students from National Taiwan University attended, paying $1,000 per day for 3 days, and they think worth it. But I want to convince you there are other ways, cheaper and more effective. Well, this is just one representative opinion. James Pratt thinks the ability to come up with a creative approach to problem can be cultivated, but it cannot be taught. because it's more of an art than a craft. Well, it used to be an art, but I think it can now become a craft. That's a miracle, which is hard to believe. So I will try to convince you. In the past, you can do it by some process of cultivation known as osmosis, meaning you work with a great master like Confucius, and you start sweeping the floor and work your way up, and day and night you live with him, and his influence is insidious, and eventually some of his disciples become just as creative, okay? But that's not terribly effective because public education now is very widespread. You know, everyone has the right. How are you going to get that many Confucius to teach? It's impossible. So a better way is to find if there really is a way of teaching, and I believe, yes, there is, but I have to convince you. I already told you about the small result research in the past century, okay? So I won't repeat. If you want to learn certain craft, like a judo, you know, martial art, you follow a great master. A great master usually knows how to train you in the most efficient and effective way. And in art, in music, performance, dancing, everything, you follow a great master. That's a sure way to do it. But not in creativity, because it's very strange, very, very strange. Even the creator themselves had no idea about how to be done, even after the fact. In other words, they know how to be creative. And they are creative, but they did not know how to be creative. Okay? And the illustration is from the following. Carl Felix is a German mathematician. It's a public certified genius. This is what he said. Okay? He solved a long-standing problem, but he said it's like a sudden flash of lightning, very sudden, like eureka. The riddle happened to be solved. To be solved. He didn't solve it, it just solved automatically for him, okay? And I myself cannot say what was the conducting thread which connected what I previously knew with what made my success possible. Okay? No idea. If he had no idea, how could he teach you? And this is more recent. Gary Bunig is the inventor of scanning tunnel microscope. And he got, I think, Nobel Prize in Physics, what year I forgot. And he wrote a book, more like an autobiography about creative process. The title is Aus dem Nichts. In German means out of nothing. Anyone from Germany? No, doesn't matter. Out of nothing. You think just like lightning coming out of blue sky, out of nothing. That's creativity. It's not learning from someone. And someone said it was patterned by the muse, okay? Now, this is another, Albert St. George. He said research, but I substituted the word to discovery. So discovery is to see what everybody else has seen and to think what nobody else had thought. It means that the muse is around to patronize anyone who recognize the opportunity. And if you let the muse go, it's gone forever, okay? So what makes the difference? And I think I'll give you something so that you can appreciate why this happened, okay? In the past, there are two camps. That's in the past century. One is elitist camp, mean genius, they have a different way of thinking style, which means if you want to be a genius, the only way is pick the right parents, okay? Forget it. And then there is a non-elite group who think genius knew more, had better technique, and more motivated, work harder. I think modern education emphasizes working harder, more motivated, and these are all, you know, the topic about American public education surrounding how to make the student more motivated, work harder, and they just won't. Why? Because the stuff is boring. Even I will fail asleep. Yeah. All right. There is an interesting one, Sharon Bailey. You think geniuses, they're just like all of us, except they practice excellent thinking. Okay? It's correct. But she told you nothing, all right? Now, this is the reply of E.T. Bell to the claim of non-elitist school. If drudgery alone suffices, how is it that many gluttons for hard work who seems to know everything about just about some branch of science, while excellent critics and commentators never themselves make even the small little discovery? That's of course very harsh, but I think there's a good point. Okay, this is the work of the Dean Simonton back in the 80s. And this is of course a little funny, but in that I missed some point when I first looked at it. Okay, this is a ranking of which means creativity, okay? And correlation with education. Can you see my arrow? Okay. You see, without education, with minimal education, of course you cannot be very creative because you don't have sufficient knowledge to deal with problems. And without education, the creativity rises sharply, 直线上升, rise sharply, linearly up. But of course, it doesn't go that way. It level off, like many things in real world, and then decline. Funny thing about it is, doctor's degree seems to give you less creativity than master's degree. Where's the peak? Okay. The way I remember this peak is, it's about the time Bill Gates and Steve Jobs quit college. That's easy to remember, right? I hate to remember. I always try to come up with something to help me remember things that's important. And unimportant thing, I did not even bother to remember. Anyway, all right, that's a little strange. It requires some explanation. But I want to assure you, this is a result of statistical average. You may be exception. Therefore, in Chinese, 不要对号入座, okay? Why is that? I'll explain. But there's something I missed at first glance. I noticed that doctor degree holder even are less creative than people with a minimum education. That's even stranger, okay? I'm not going to talk about this, okay? This is, I think, people perhaps agree with it, but this is not my topic, leadership. There is another curve which looks like a mirror image type or inverted. Dogmatism is inverted relationship. And that lets you correlate dogmatism with creativity. The more you study, the more you become dogmatic, and your brain becomes more like stiffened or hardened, like boiled egg. All right, so there's a relation. But why and how to get out of this, predicament? It's not answered. And I'll try to give you an answer. Now, about authority. Perhaps Dr. Scheer did not give you an explicit indication that I am an outsider. I was an outsider, and perhaps even now will be considered an outsider, because I continue to be at art with the mainstream psychology. But there is something encouraging. The Eastern society, the Confucian society, usually respect the elder and authority. Okay? And of course, parents, authority is, so are teachers. But Chikedi did a serious study, okay? And he found that expert and authority are not reliable judge in dealing with controversial issues. Experts are very good in routine. They know just about every existing method. But when there was a controversial issue, they're more often they're wrong than correct. That's very interesting. But that's, of course, encouraging to someone like myself who I consider to be an outsider. This is the Newsweek of, I think it's 2010, several years ago. You know, the main article in this issue of Newsweek is the creativity crisis in America. And it indicated that there's a steady decline since the 1990s, okay? Not before, okay? Since 1990, the American creativity steadily declined. And yet, the IQ, intelligence quotient, continue to inch up. And people, of course, speculate about it. Why IQ went up but creativity went down? Well, if that's true, then IQ is not a good indicator for creativity, which I think IQ has some correlation. But of course, there's this problem, okay? The correlation breakdown. This is very interesting because it really appeared in a mainstream journal, mainstream article. So I would suspect these two persons, two German investigators, they may not be mainstream. They wrote an article called Eureka Moment. It's really about creativity. And they said, they indicate knowledge hinders discovery. And people who, if you push this to the extreme, people who possess the least possible knowledge are in the best position to crack a case. Then the less you know, the better off. And I'll explain this later. Maybe not later. If you go back to this, it's not because you know less. It's because you're an outsider. Outsiders have a better chance of cracking a problem because they are not confined by dogma. Every field has a dogma. So after a while, dissidents are expelled. And people who stay in the community, they brainwash each other. Relax. Okay, that's why. That's why difficult problems are usually solved by an outsider. Okay. Now, the cognitive scientists of the 20th century and 21st century, they are indulged in studying the brain mechanism and so on and so on. And they think if they knew more about the molecular and cellular detail of the brain, they can solve the problem. Unfortunately, that seems to be the wrong way. I'm not saying what they study are not valuable. But creativity is a holistic process. It takes the whole human brain or body to do it. And you study the local thing. In America, we ridicule people like this called reductionist. And I have to confess, I spent over 30 years in reductionist science. Reductionist. At one time, I studied only a single molecule. Okay? Reductionist. Reductionists cannot solve a big problem, like a system problem, which takes the whole body. Okay, where is my clue? My clue was what traditional psychologists ignore. It went back as far as Galileo, that's 400 years ago. Mozart, okay, I have a letter to show you. Gauss, you just saw it. I was benefited both by a French mathematician named Henri Poincaré in 1908. He wrote a book that thick, and I managed to get a copy from, old bookseller for US 60 bucks. It was printed in 1913, before any of us here was born. He wrote about his experience as a creator, but he was not trained. So psychologists did not pay attention to him, think he's just a lay person, outsider. Okay, that's it. And this, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk, but it's also 1908. This is very important, but unfortunate. If I have time, I'll mention it. Nikola Tesla, I just mentioned. He wrote an autobiography in 1919, but published in an obscure journal for electrical experimenter. And people thought that was in Serbian. Tesla was a Serbian. but his autobiography is bilingual. I was surprised to find out in 2003. And the English part was written by himself, with a strange way of spelling, that kind of thing. Einstein wrote about his thinking process in 1945. So there are these, date back to 400 years. These are all ignored. That is the problem, because they contain very important clue. Clue by a layperson, that's why they ignore, okay? Okay, Newton said he was standing on the shoulder of giant, right? And anyone who is doing contemporary science would have to base his or her study on someone else's work. Okay? You have to stand on the shoulder of giant, or even not giant, because even the worst paper may have something to offer, okay? And I want to trace the ancestry of what I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about, starting with this same Simonton you just saw, a few slides before. Chance configuration theory of creativity. It was not a successful theory, but had some redeeming value. Okay, and this must claim ancestry in D.T. Campbell. He also had a theory. He's a theoretician, a philosopher. Okay, and before that it's Baldwin, and before that is Charles Darwin. Okay, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, of course, is well known. But Baldwin found that the process of evolution is very similar to learning process or creative process. Okay, he pointed out the similarity. And Campbell built his theory on top of that, and so did Simonton. And now, I claim I'm going to refurbish Simonton's model to make it work. Okay? And I pick it because I think it's most convenient. Okay? Chance configuration model. How do you solve problem? According to this model, you search for answers. You have to find the answer first. Okay? You think. That's what people say. Think. And then you might come up with several answers. Not all of them are correct. There's a few candidates. Then you have to select the one that's most likely to be correct. And then you have to verify it. You have to double check. Okay, that's the third step. But if you look at the theory of evolution, it's a mutation. Mutation means change of idea. You have to search for answer. You cannot just fix on an answer. You have to keep changing it until the one that's likely to be successful pop up. That's why it's so bad to live in a conformity society. Everybody thinks the same way. And if we're wrong, we were wrong together. Of course, if we are right, we're right together. Mutation. And in modern world, in America, people emphasize diversity. In university, diversity, that's a key word, okay? And I think in Taiwan, it's also emphasizing diversity, and people now pay more attention to the native Taiwanese culture. And then suddenly, wow, like Bu Nongzu, they're singing. I think that's very unique. Well, let me not wander off the tangent, because otherwise I won't have time to show a movie. I want to show a movie of Colombo to illustrate my point. Okay, the second step is, after mutation, you have to select the more likely answer. For the answer to be correct, that trait, this favorable trait of genetics, must be able to pass on to the progeny, the next generation. Otherwise, it won't work. So if there's a mutation and that individual becomes sterile, that's the end of it, okay? So did you see there's a similarity? It's strange. I think there must be a microphone picking up. All right, chance of configuration really is a three-step. There must be speakers that will pick up. Or maybe the speaker. Let me shut it off. Okay. Oh, this is better. Now, I find it's more convenient to combine the first step because when you choose and select, usually you did it almost simultaneously, concurrently, so to speak. So I change it to search and match. You search to match the problem. Search the answer to match the problem, and then verify. Now you shut it off. Hello? Okay, that's better, thank you. All right. The first type of Simon's model is a blind search. It really is not a very good idea, excuse me. Yes, you're right. Something is wrong, right. You must have turned it off. Machine? Help. You can turn it off like that. Okay, I think I can talk. Remember, the first step of Simon's model is blind search. Blind search means you have no clue. You search blindly. I hope it's not enough. Okay, we can wait. Okay, at least I can. Blind search. Why blind search is not a good strategy? Then you depend on your luck. Yeah, but the problem is, don't turn it off too soon, you might burn it out. Can you? That's bad news. Okay, well, I might as well use this time to introduce a concept called combinatorial explosion. Okay? Combinatorial explosion is a jargon, but I think it's easy to understand. In 1996, the World Championship of chess, the Russian champion, Garry Kasparov, has a big match with a supercomputer, an IBM supercomputer called Deep Blue. The two match. Okay? And Garry Kasparov won the game, but in 1997 he lost to the supercomputer. Okay, chess game. Why is chess game so fascinating? You want to beat your opponent, right? So you move, you make a move, but your opponent will try to survive. Okay, it's the now. Be patient. Okay, I can talk without it. Okay, let me continue. But the thing, your opponent are not roll over and play dead. Will try to beat you also. So you make a move, you must consider what your opponent could do in the so-called counter move. Therefore, you have to plan ahead. What if your opponent has this counter move and you have counter move? Your opponent will have counter move. Okay. All right. No. It's okay. No, okay. Then you reopen the file. It may work. Okay, let me continue my talk. If you want to predict the strategy against a counter move in mid-game, the possibility, 1,000 possibility, okay? If you want to consider two step, two step each, the possibility become 1 million. And you have to consider the consequence. 3 step each, 1 billion. So it's just grow like that. It's like a process of explosion. Okay. No, I don't think that is a problem. Okay. Very sorry about this condition. Okay, so in chess game, you're not supposed to consider all possibility. Okay? You prefer to consider certain more likely possibility, but you want to think ahead several steps. The IBM computer, much faster, it's an enormous memory, can afford to think more possibility, right? But even IBM supercomputer consider only 13 steps, okay? 13 steps, that's a lot, okay? Therefore, random trial is like finding a needle in the haystack. You have to be extremely lucky. Remember, there's a common saying that if you give the monkey a typewriter, the possibility that monkey would compose a Shakespearean sonnet is very, thank you, I think it works. Very unlikely, okay? You don't do it that way. You have to have certain strategy. And usually we say smart people, they know how to cut into the problem and try to reach the heart of the problem. And not so smart people may have to fool around a while and eventually find the answer. Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, sure it works. All right. Normally, if we want to find something, a solution, or some lost item, we have to define a range to search, right? If I drop something, the first thing I will look for is the floor on the desk. And depending on the time, after a day, it may migrate, so I have to search the entire room or even outside, okay? That's called search space. You have to define it because otherwise you could not complete your task of searching in your lifetime. Okay, so I want to introduce that concept of search. Okay, here we are. Blind search, the search space is too large. It's not practical, okay? Don't worry, I didn't take time. Maybe I didn't let it go. Okay, here we are. But dogmatic people, they search for answer only from what they had learned. That's too small. Because people who are dogmatic, they tend to have something called self-imposed constraint. And usually we say, find by the proverbial box. If you want to find extraordinary way of solving a problem, you have to jump out of the box. And the box really is the dogma. Blind search too large, dogmatism too small, too narrow. What is the optimum? It's called heuristic search. That's acceptable. But the problem is, what is heuristic search? And many people who know how to do a heuristic search, but couldn't tell you how to. And I want to put not an equal sign. If you want to do heuristic search, you must also think in picture. But I need explanation. heuristic search